Hello and welcome to Cypherpunk Bitstream, episode 0x06, Security, episode 2. I'm Smuggler, and I'm here in TAZ0 with my co-host and good friend,
Frank Braun. Welcome.
So Frank, tell us what this topic is for today.
Well, today we're going to talk about the future of security. In the last episode, we talked about the current state of security, and now we're looking at future trends, and we're going to focus more on the dystopian side, and then have a third part, which is a little bit less dystopian, I think, but still somewhat dystopian. So a bit bleak, but still interesting, I guess.
And I actually think we should issue a trigger warning. If you are easy to scare, this might not be the episode for you.
If you're not scared by the virus already, you will be scared afterwards.
Well, we will see. We'll see. So there's always hope, but the hope is in the next episode. It's not in this one.
Exactly.
If everything fails, then this episode describes our future, and if the project of crypto anarchy and everything related has some success, we might be able to avert that future.
I hope so. So, in order to look at future security, I think we should focus first off about crimes that really matter.
Yeah. I think it's one of the things that puzzles people is how do security forces select the crimes that they really battle against, and which are the crimes that they ignore? Because all of our experience probably is that police is not really effective in what they do. Apparently, they still haven't managed to get rid of most of crime. And
the war on drugs is still ongoing.
The war on drugs, plus, easier things like simple robberies on the street is a thing that still happens. So apparently, all that crime fighting has limited long-term successes. And when you look at the statistics of how many criminals are actually caught and put into jail for their crimes, compared to the number of crimes that are actually committed, that's, in most cases, that's not a very good statistic for the police.
Well, I think one has to understand that the state really is focusing on crimes that pose a systematic risk to itself, and some crimes that have a very high impact on the public image.
Yeah.
So that's why when there is like some poor little girl has been kidnapped and it becomes a very public case, there will be a lot of resources spent onto that case. But other cases which are similar but which don't have that much public attention, that are usually not that many resources spent on it. But in terms of systemic risk, I think there are like a few general categories that states actually spend a lot of effort on, and it's not usually perceived that much. For example, proliferation.
Yeah, but let's start with the very low-hanging fruits first, because those are the things that matter most in the public perception, and that are crimes where the population has a very high identification with the victims. This is, for example, child abuse, child pornography, burglaries, stuff like that. So those are crimes where, when they're committed, a lot of the public can put itself into the shoes of the victim. So, for example, burglaries, home burglaries. It happens a lot, and when it happens, people are really pissed about it. And
because it violates their private sphere.
And it means that their expectation to what the state should do, that is protect them, is undermined. And that is one of the reasons why burglary in the last years has received so much attention from police and politics. So, for example, here in Germany, it's the field where predictive policing was legalized the first time. And there have also been conversations, and actually laws, of making organized burglary one of the crimes that justifies data retention and I think even Trojans to be introduced in computers. So, and the main reason there is simply that a lot of home burglaries undermine the security feeling of the people, because everybody has a home. Everybody can imagine what it means to come home and, you're robbed. So that is one of the classical crimes that police kind of has to deal with to not lose their support in the population.
Same with murder.
Same with murder, or the young child that gets kidnapped. But it's also true for child pornography, for example, where the presence of child porn on the internet faces or creates this image that everybody can identify with the image or with the victim, or at least we perceive young kids and old people as being deserving more security or protection.
Being very vulnerable.
They're very vulnerable, and we have this urge, this duty to protect them. You can actually see that when there are experiments for that, where actors have staged crimes on the street, like assault, and then measured how many people reacted to it and intervened. So the assault against a 20, 30-year-old man gets almost no intervention, while the assault against a 60-year-old, 70-year-old grandma or a 5, 6-year-old child receives a lot of intervention. Many more people intervene. And there's a wider field of people that intervene. The age groups are much wider. It's both women and men that intervene in those cases. So we perceive those groups as deserving more protection and being unable to defend themselves. And we like to externalize intervention to the professionals of the state. So when we witness or at least perceive a lot of crime against those vulnerable groups, there's more political pressure. And that is one of the reasons why, for example, crimes against older people, especially in the field of fraud and scams, etc., receives a lot of political attention, including the changes of laws for surveillance and stuff like that. And when you look at child porn, I think child porn is the universal crime that everybody gets behind the police and says, yeah, we have to do more against that. And that is used as a justification for surveillance, for higher prison sentences, etc. It's the abomination of the 21st century is child pornography. And there's no moral question about it. There's no mitigating factor about it. Everybody is against it. And nobody has 0% empathy with the criminal ever.
Yeah, that's right.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have the crimes that are a systemic risk by themselves, not by how they're perceived by the population and political pressure, but crimes that immediately threaten the state itself.
Yeah, so to be clear, on the lower end, what we just talked about, that kind of undermines the belief in the state and the justification for it. So people, if there's a lot of murder, a lot of kidnapping, a lot of burglaries, then people lose trust in the system. There are other crimes which can be very high and they don't really affect the trust that much, like insurance fraud, for example, where there is no victim that people identify with. Nobody's sorry about big corporations being scammed, for example.
And it's also one of the main crimes that almost everybody commits. So there's more identification with the criminal than with the victim.
Yeah. I think with like non-violent drug crimes, it's similar, that there's a lot of people that don't care anymore, or that use recreational drugs themselves, so they don't really see that as a problem. But yeah, to go back to the big ones, the crimes that really matter, so that pose a systematic risk in itself. Like one I just mentioned earlier was proliferation, which is usually defined as atomic weapons getting into the hand of states that don't already have them, or usually they call them the bad ones.
Mm-hmm.
There's like this distinction between the good states and the bad states, and the bad states shouldn't have the nukes, only the good ones. And then also like non-state actors. Nobody wants non-state actors to have atomic weapons.
Those real systematic crimes that matter, you can usually identify by reading the tasking of intelligence agencies. When you read the tasking, for example, of the German BND, which is a foreign intelligence agency of Germany, it is proliferation, transnational organized crime, and then they're kind of silent about the, spying on people for political reasons. But proliferation is a huge thing. We have thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons out there. And latest with the fall of the Soviet bloc, not just the USSR, but the related countries, there has been a real issue of nuclear material and nuclear weapons spreading, which is actually one of the interesting aspects of history, that when the USSR fell, or restructured, or however you want to call it, it is that aspect of anti-proliferation where the Western states, the former enemy states, and the USSR started to cooperate really quickly. Because in the depths of Siberia, there were hundreds of nuclear batteries, for example, that could be used as dirty bombs.
Mm.
And there were hundreds of nuclear warheads as well that were hard to control, with the military not being paid and stuff like that. So what actually happened is that the West sent special teams to the former Soviet zone to help the Soviets with securing weapons. However, those weapons they're an enormous price. Every rogue state wants to get their hands on one. And every terrorist organization wants one. There's an enormous demand for it. And control security on that is not that trivial. So, of course, weapons today are built to be not exploded by every random people that just pushes a switch. But both the knowledge and the materials are widely available. And you have that on the state actor side. I mean, just for example, you have Iran. It's one of the big examples. Or Libya was trying to get its hands on a nuclear bomb. Or you have North Korea, which is a big thing still. And there is a huge blind field of what is actually happening with proliferation. Nuclear material smuggling is probably the lower end of the spectrum. And then there's a lot of technology smuggling, and then the complete warhead smuggling, of course. And the problem is big enough that, for example, most areas of this world are covered by nuclear incident response teams that are specialized in flying in and diffusing nuclear devices. There are sensor networks widely distributed in some countries that are for detecting nuclear material. You have that quite a lot in the US. Even inside of the US in bigger cities, you have that. You have isotope scanning and stuff like that. And you often have that at the borders, where basically you have a Geiger counter built into some wall. And then when the truck passes by, it checks if there's high radiation coming from the truck. Stuff like that is pretty universal. Of course, there are places where it's not done, depth of Africa and stuff like that. But in the Western world, finding nuclear materials, finding nuclear devices is a very big priority.
Mm. Do you have any idea how many rogue warheads are out there?
There are a lot.
If there are any.
So the official statement by all Western governments is there are none out there.
Which kind of helps, like, keeping the public pacified.
I think a lot of people would start to panic if they knew that there were, 10 bombs out there that could be used anytime. There are unofficial ideas about how many nuclear warheads are out there. And that
we're talking about the ones that are not in state hands.
Yeah, those that are not in the hands of states that we trust to be able to control.
Yeah.
So there are guesses that go up to 150 warheads that are out there. That's a big number. And quite a lot of them are former Soviet warheads. And there are also a few missing US warheads out there where the United States more or less says, okay, it's on the depth of an ocean. It's a nuclear sub that sunk and took the warheads with them, and, or it fell from a bomber plane into the ocean and it sank and nobody can get it. It's kind of quite fascinating if you read up on these cases of lost warheads. A lot of those cases are public, where there were just accidents.
Yeah, this bomber flying around with the warhead attached to it, and they kind of forgot about that it's actually out there, stuff like that, right?
Yeah, it starts with bombers flying around and the bomb detaching from the bomber. That has happened at least 3 times in the past. There has been a pretty big surge, I think in the 60s or 70s in the Mediterranean, where exactly that happened, where I think actually 2 warheads were lost by an airplane over the Mediterranean Sea. And there have been at least 2 cases of nuclear submarines that sank or lost nuclear torpedoes or missiles. Then there is the issue of logistical errors.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
That is it's a common thing apparently. And I think it's one of the most recent cases that we know about is you ship your nuclear warhead from one base to the other and somehow mess up the paperwork and then you don't know where it is. That is something that has happened. Then there are more or less confirmed cases of suitcase bombs that were deployed mostly by the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and not all of them appear to have been recovered. So these are basically small nuclear warheads that fit into oversized female luggage and that can be manually triggered. And the idea there was to have a second strike option that is already in place. So they had sleeper agents with those devices, and in case of war, they would trigger those bombs. But a lot of the field is rumors. The states are not really happy about telling too many stories. You kind of have to rely on people that come from the field and are not on the payroll anymore. There are a few scattered news reports and stuff like that. I'm not aware of a really good history of lost nuclear warheads, but I think that the guesses, I'm not sure if 150 is realistic, but I'm pretty sure it's several dozen warheads that are in circulation. And the interesting thing is, just because they're in circulation doesn't matter too much if it's just a few. So you can't go on eBay and buy a nuclear warhead, which means that when you acquire a nuclear warhead today, your cost of actually exploding it are really high because you cannot replace it. And they make most sense as a deterrent threat. So if you're a smaller country and you can make your enemies believe that you have a nuclear device and that you're able to deliver it, that prevents your opponents from attacking you or makes it much harder to attack you. However, the moment you explode it and you don't have a second device left, then you will be obliterated by everybody. So just the existence of the warheads doesn't mean that there's a high risk of them being used.
Would be different for terrorist organization though, right? They might have the incentive to actually deliver it.
I'm not 100% sure about that, because a lot of terrorist organizations, bigger gangs, etc., they rely on secure territory that is usually the product of a hollowed out state. But a hollowed out state is a state that internally doesn't have any power, but externally still has legitimacy. So an example for that is Afghanistan or Iraq or Mexico. I'm sorry, Mexicans. But those are states that internally have relatively little control, but externally have some legitimacy, meaning that they are still the ones responsible for dealing with stuff internally. However, if you as a terror organization have such a safe haven and you go too far, your whole state might not matter anymore. A good example for that is Afghanistan, I think. When 9/11 happened, all gloves came off when it came to Afghanistan. It wasn't Afghanistan that was attacking the US, but it was the regime in Afghanistan tolerating the Al-Qaeda cells. And with that big attack, all the discussion basically fell away. And I mean, there were dozens of countries that agreed on taking down the Taliban regime or government. So
it might be the same mechanism, right? That they, let's say they would have one at their home turf. That would really be really useful as a deterrent. But once they use it externally, they become very vulnerable in their own territory because their hollowed state doesn't help them anymore.
Exactly. So if you only have one of those devices, you have a very, very high cost of deploying it. And there's also the issue that just having the device doesn't mean that you're able to trigger it, depending on where it comes from, how modern it is. and you also have to maintain it. They decay like everything else. And this wasn't a pun. And they also, if you want to use it, you have to deploy it somehow. And for a terrorist organization, that might work because they say, okay, we're going to just suicide ourselves with it. But for state actors, that's different. You have to find reliable people that would actually blow up the bomb and not get away. Or you need reliable remote triggers and stuff like that. So in reality, it's a lot more complicated than just having the warhead. And it's pretty likely that a lot of the warheads out there are not deployable. However,
because they're too old, or
because they're too old, because information on how to actually trigger them is not available. So there are quite a few, like modern-ish nuclear warheads. There's not a switch that you can, trigger and then the thing explodes. But there's, you need to be able to trigger it in a very specific way, like a physical, very specific way that is close to cryptographic security. So if you don't have the right way on how to trigger it, when to explode, which part of the warhead, they might not have a nuclear reaction at all. So you might have the device, but not know how to actually create a nuclear explosion there. And then, as I mentioned, deployment, etc. Most organizations are not able to deploy something like that, like on a missile or something. And even then, I mean, just imagine you're Al-Qaeda and you're sitting in Afghanistan and the biggest rocket you have goes 100 kilometers wide. You're not even able to reach your enemies. So it doesn't really make sense for you to try it. And
it's not like you can just fly it over easily.
True. Though, of course, they look into stuff like that. But and that is one of the issues why you have these radiation detectors at ports, for example. Of course, there's this fear that a device like that gets smuggled into the country and then exploded. And that is why the US has radiation detectors at, I think, every major international port.
But all of this explains why the fight against proliferation, I mean, given that, let's say, there are like a dozen or a few dozen warheads already out there, that the fight is still ongoing. Because it's not like once the cat is out of the bag, it's game over situation, but it's actually a different one. It would be a very different scenario if you could actually buy warheads on eBay.
Yeah, so, I think that would be a pretty bad scenario.
Or if you could, let's say, if a terrorist organization gets a hold of 10 warheads, that's very different.
That would be a game changer, yeah.
Yeah, so...
and that means that anti-proliferation is ongoing and basically tries to capture every warhead that is out there, but also keep new warheads, new material, new knowledge from spreading, and also try to prevent that warheads are concentrated. And anti-proliferation can have it can have stark consequences. So, for example, in Iran, anti-proliferation means that nuclear scientists are killed by the Mossad and by the CIA probably. So that's an ongoing fight there. And it's probably the one that is most justified and understandable for most people. Because everybody can understand that, okay, terror organization with a couple of nuclear warheads is a scenario we really don't want.
Yeah, I agree. And like you said, that's why most intelligence agencies have that as like their stated goal is to prevent proliferation or actually gathering intelligence about proliferation and then using that intelligence or giving it to other organizations trying to prevent proliferation.
Yeah.
The other one you mentioned is transnational organized crime. Why do you think that's so important to prevent for intelligence agencies? What is the threat there?
Depending on the size, transnational organizations and criminal organizations have the ability to kind of act like states.
So you're not talking about the UN or right now. You really
no. I'm talking about they call transnational criminal organizations, and then of course there are all the other transnational international criminal organizations like the UN. But no, I'm talking about stuff like narco cartels, MS-13 triads, etc. The interesting aspect of those organizations is their combination of having forces that they can deploy in some country while at the same time have a safe haven somewhere else. Let's take the example of MS-13. MS-13 has dozens of thousands of members in the US. They are highly armed. There are subgroups that are highly trained. They make a shitload of money with extortion and with drugs, of course. And one of the interesting aspects is if one of them gets into trouble, one of those members gets into trouble, it's relatively easy to fly them out to Honduras and to protect them. Because MS-13, among other places, has safe haven in Honduras. They also have a few places in Belize and stuff like that. And safe haven basically means areas in which the police is not able to operate. No-go areas. When you look at Al-Qaeda, for example, terrorist organization, but what made them really dangerous was their ability to go to Afghanistan and parts of Africa and basically be able to sleep, to train, to procreate, etc. You know, they could have a life. And that is long-term really important for such an organization being able to survive. And you find that with a lot of the rather dangerous organizations. So
I was just struck by the similarity to actually countries engaging in wars.
It's exactly the same.
As long as they have their own base, it's not like their home country being under total war. That is such a big advantage they have there. They have their home turf, and they can send out troops and send, injured soldiers back, produce materials in their home turf and stuff like that. And similar to what you said about the MS-13, if some of the guys, does a contract killing, for example, they can just ship him out immediately afterwards. And then it's much, much harder for law enforcement to actually first figure out who the murder was. And second, even if they do, to get at him because he's now in Honduras in a no-go area.
Yeah. And that is one of the reasons transnational organized crime is an issue.
Because in a way, they're kind of competing with states on that level, right?
They have this low level of immunity or sovereignty even. And they are in hostile interaction with other states. So I don't really like to call it warfare because there is usually no political aspect to it. So in terrorism, you have political aspects to it. And nation against nation wars, you have a political aspect to it. For transnational organized crime, usually the political aspect is near zero. And they're just quote unquote criminals. But the impact that they can have can be threatening to a nation, especially long term.
I mean, for terrorism, you would have a political aspect to it, which is kind of the differentiating factor between terrorist organizations, international ones, and transnational crime organizations.
Right. Though there's a gray area between those two, because people on the wrong side of the law tend to cooperate as well. So what you have are cooperations between terrorist organizations and pure criminal organizations. That is where the term narco-terrorism comes from, where the cooperation between drug cartels and terror organizations exists, which is mostly an issue for Latin America and hasn't really spread towards other regions or even into the US. But you have similar overlaps, sometimes even to rogue elements of states. So, for example, there have been more or less proven cooperations between Venezuelan intelligence and drug cartels. And there are at least well-founded allegations against Iran, for example, in supporting terrorists by using organized crime. And that shouldn't be a shock to anybody, because one of the countries that is mostly complaining about this mixture of organized crime and terrorism is actually the United States. They did the same thing.
They kind of invented the concept, right?
I'm not sure if they invented it, but there has been this big scandal called Iran-Contra, which was basically the same thing. You have cocaine and you have weapons and you have terrorists. Okay, freedom fighters. But, for the one it's a terrorist, for the other it's a freedom fighter. So it's not an unheard of concept for the US itself.
Well, I mean, terrorism is expensive and organized crime is very profitable, so they kind of go hand in hand.
And they often share resources, especially when it comes to logistics and materials like weapons. So there's a natural closeness often between those two. And even for the drug sellers, it makes a lot of sense to support terrorism in the target market, because a scared population is more likely to use drugs.
Interesting theory.
Marketing.
And it kind of keeps the law enforcement agencies busy with bigger targets.
So, but I think the real issue with transnational organized crime is the long-term effects. What happens is that big criminal organizations that you cannot easily control because of safe haven, etc., have this tendency to undermine the state institutions themselves by corruption, by blackmail, by threats. Just imagine you're a narco cartel and you have to get tons of produce from Mexico to the US. You want to reduce the losses that you have there, both in person and in goods. One of the things that you will start to do is pay people for information, pay police, pay intelligence agency personnel for information which controls would be to be expected. And you have the next step then is the classical look away bribe, where you pay the customs officer or the air traffic controller, etc. And if you do that enough and often enough over a long term, the loyalty and trust relationships within the institutions are undermined. That's the problem of corruption against official organizations. And
that's basically the situation Mexico's in right now, right? Combined with a lot of threats and people getting killed, but it's often, threatening and bribing are both offered at the same time.
Yes. And I think that Mexico is a good example, because in a lot of territories of Mexico, the police is not part of the state security apparatus anymore. It's either completely ineffective or working for the cartels, which is one of the reasons that the military had to be deployed. And with the military, you have the same thing. Sooner or later, corruption subverts those command structures as well and corrupts the mission. And you have that nearly everywhere where you have corruption going on in organizations that cannot be switched off. You also have that in the banking world, for example, where the compliance officers are bribed. And if you do that often enough, it can threaten a whole financial marketplace. And it's one of the things that you could actually see in the US in the 80s in Miami. Miami basically didn't work anymore when it came to anti-money laundering, etc. And a big part of that was corruption. And similar things happen all around the world. And that makes those organizations a real big threat because they subvert the state from within. They're not just an external threat, but they're also an internal threat. If they have the ability to switch the allegiances of bureaucrats, of police commanders, etc., then the actual power of the political head of the state becomes more an illusion than an actuality. It's not a fact anymore. So that is the systemic risk of those organizations.
We have a third one, which is bioterrorism. They usually don't have that as a threat to prevent in and of itself, but I think it's becoming more and more important.
Sometimes it's captured under proliferation. Sometimes it's an extra thing, and sometimes it's not mentioned in the official mission yet, because bioterrorism is also it's a little bit murky area, because especially when states are involved in it, it's really hard to say what is preparation for terrorism, what is preparation for building defenses, etc. But with the progress in biotechnology, both when it comes to sequencing DNA, when it comes to assembling DNA, CRISPR, etc., it's a growing threat.
Well, it's definitely a growing threat. I mean, you can download a lot of virus genomes from the internet, and once DNA synthesizing becomes good enough, you can basically build your own smallpox and other things, which is a huge threat and achievable probably not just for state actors but for non-state actors as well.
For sure, and it's the threat of bioterrorism by non-state actors is not something that has never happened before. So at least one non-state organization has actually committed acts of bioterrorism without subverting a nation-state source itself.
The thing in Japan? Or
exactly.
what was the name?
Shinriku was a cult that turned doomsday cult at some point, and they engaged in acts of both bioterrorism and chemical terrorism. So the thing that is most known about them are the Tokyo subway attacks, where they spread sarin gas in the Tokyo subway, killing, I think, 12 people and hurting a few thousand. And it was good luck that not more people were killed because the sarin used was of very low quality, but they already had batches of much higher quality. And
they manufactured it themselves.
And if they had used the high quality sarin, it would have probably killed in the range of 2,000 to 5,000 people. And what is less known about them is that they undertook at least 2, maybe even 3 attacks with bioweapons. They, among other things, equipped trucks with a spraying mechanism to spray anthrax throughout the city. And what prevented anybody from actually getting sick is that the anthrax that they stole was a degraded version that was actually for creating vaccines. And they didn't know that. And as far as I know, they also tried a Botulino attack, which, as far as I know, didn't have any fatalities as well. And then, of course, you have the 2001 anthrax attacks in the US, which most likely go back to anthrax being stolen from the US government, but that killed several people, actually. So bioterrorism is it's not just a future thing. It's a thing that has happened several times already. And it's actually a classical thing. I mean, the settlers to the US used warfare against natives. You had Byzantine troops in the 5th, 6th century using bioweapons against enemies. So it's not a new thing.
No, it's definitely not a new thing. I just think that like some technological developments make it much more likely and easier to do. And I think bioweapons are kind of especially interesting for terrorist organizations because it's much harder to target them. I mean, let's say you're spreading a virus. It's making a targeted virus still seems to be pretty hard. Although there are rumors that what's going on in China right now is a targeted bio attack. But I think that's too early to tell if there's any like truth to that. But so like as a terrorist organization, when you just want to create terror, a bioweapon is really useful. As a state actor, it kind of has a danger of a big blowback to your own population.
I think there are 2 kinds of bioweapons in that we're talking about here. So for states, bioweapons that are not self-spreading are the most interesting ones. So mostly bacteria, sometimes viruses that don't have the ability to spread unlimited. For example, anthrax attacks, there is no real huge danger of human-to-human transmission in such an attack, because it's relatively easy to detect, etc. So the contagion can be stopped. Same is true for several viruses that were experimented with as bioweapons, where either it's easy to contain, or where the infectious chains are very short and unstable. So there, like a lot of those viruses have been created so they fatally mutate very quickly. So they spread 1 or 2 hops and then they die. And that is what states are most interested in. For terrorist organizations, I don't actually think that bioweapons are such a good pick, because as a terrorist organization, you have political goals, usually. And that means that you have to execute force and then attach your threat and your demands and whatever to it. And bioweapons are inherently non-attributable.
It depends on your level of nihilism, I guess. I mean, there's like doomsday sects that's kind of fitting weapon there.
Yeah,
sure. When you want to have a like political goal, achieve a political goal, that's kind of hard with a spreading bioweapon.
Yeah. Sometimes I have these days when I wonder when the first radical environmentalist creates something like that to get rid of the biggest threat to the planet, which is apparently humans.
Well, there you have it. I mean, that would be a very fitting use of a bioweapon for a political goal.
Yeah.
I mean, that's unfortunately not unrealistic. And I mean, if somebody gets a hold of smallpox or something like that, that would be a
not
real
a good
party
day.
pooper. Yeah.
Not a good day.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we kind of pictured the crimes that really matter. And I think the crimes that really matter is what the state is actually mostly focused about. I mean, the smaller crimes we talked about earlier is more about
Pacifying the population,
keeping the legitimacy. Maybe you want to repeat a little bit what the context was from the last episode.
Yeah, I think that the crimes that really matter, like proliferation, bioterrorism, transnational organized crime, they have something in common. And that is that they are technology-supported crimes. For nuclear weapons, that is easy to understand. You know, there's this huge technological apparatus, and it's about a technological device. Bioterrorism is the same thing. And with transnational organized crime, you have a similar huge aspect of technology. It's interesting to note that organized crime or transnational organized crime is a relatively late development. It's recent. And it only became possible by cheap travel, cheap organization, and management technologies, and cheap communication. So it's the organization of huge groups distributed over a large territory is a consequence of having the technology to actually do that.
Well, it's what drives the globalization of normal business as well, right? So it goes hand in hand with organized crime, of course.
Exactly. But what is important to note here is that these technologies, so both technologies that are off-shelf on the market technologies, as well as organization and management technologies, they support two classes of criminals that are an issue to combat because they're very hard to investigate. The one side of that, and we have talked about both of them a little bit in the last episode, is the random criminal. The random criminal is somebody who doesn't have a long track record, doesn't have a connection to the victim, picks the victim by random, and uses technology to amplify his effect. And an extreme example of that is actually child pornography. Child pornography has only become a huge issue because of digital cameras and the internet. Before that, you had to manually develop the film. There was a high risk of you being detected. You had to have relatively high knowledge of developing the film. You couldn't go to a studio to have it developed because then you would be ratted out. So it was relatively confined, and only
the whole trading was extremely hard, right? Because you somehow need to find these people in real life.
Yeah, and back then most of it was mail order or under the counter stuff, which was easy to detect, and you wouldn't, as a potential consumer of that product, you wouldn't have an easy time to find sources. And with VHS, like video cameras that record on tape, that was a thing
for the younger
listeners. Before the internet, basically, well, during the internet time, but that was before we recorded everything to SD cards. People would make VHS videos and then copy them and sell them, etc. And with the internet and with digital cameras, this has spread so much more. Now every idiot can produce child pornography, and every idiot can run a website that connects people that are interested in it. And that has had enormous consequences. If you're looking at places like the Philippines or Thailand, there are big parts of the rural population that today live on producing child pornography, starting from just recordings and then going to basically underage cam girls. And that is only possible because through the internet, there's this connection between those areas that are hard to control and very much under pressure economically, and the rich consumers in the West, basically. And in a way, everybody down there, as soon as they get the hold on a mobile phone, have the ability to participate in this international crime. And so that's a very stark example of how technology has made random criminals much more effective and give them much more opportunity. You don't have to be super smart to produce that stuff. But it's also true for stuff like skimming, like copying credit cards, etc. You don't have to be super smart yourself anymore. You just go on the darknet, you order the hardware, you put it in, and that's it. And when you look at car theft, for example, we see the same thing happening, where a couple of years ago, the key cloning devices were mostly available to big organized groups, and now they become available on AliExpress. So basically, the relatively random stupid criminal now gets a toolkit to operate on. Or look at the Pineapple, this Wi-Fi intrusion tool that you can order for $99 from the internet. A lot more stupid people now get technical abilities that allows them to randomly target people in crime, and that makes it very hard to investigate.
Yeah, so we can see there that technological progress makes it a lot easier for the average Joe to become a criminal, or the average criminal to do certain crimes that he couldn't do before, right?
And insulate himself more against investigations.
And it also allows more, let's say, virtual crime, or crime where the victim and the perpetrator are not directly connected.
Yeah.
Like, for example, the child porn, or the child underage cam girl example, where the perpetrator doesn't even have to go there.
Yeah,
which is like mediated through technology,
which also amplifies this issue of non-attribution. You have that a lot in cybercrime, where you have an attacker that sits in one country, attacks somebody in another country with off-the-shelf software that he doesn't really understand, makes money from it. Phishing is a good example in that field. Every idiot can become a fisher, and doing that makes it really, really hard to get to the criminal, because you don't have to be very smart. You randomly target victims, and you have a degree of separation that is potentially extremely hard to attribute. Getting behind those criminals with standard investigative techniques is extremely hard.
Yeah. Speaking of smartness, I think it's relatively well established that intelligence follows a normal distribution. So that kind of poses the question, what happens if you have somebody at the very right end of the IQ spectrum getting into crime, now mediated through more technology or better technology? What do you think could be potential scenarios there for very high IQ criminals?
They basically profit from the same things. So they're not necessarily as attributable, and that doesn't only apply to people that investigate them and want to catch them, but it also applies internally in an organization, which means that your ability of exercising violence becomes much less important to run a criminal organization. And with communication and management technology, smart criminals can run much bigger, much more effective, much more efficient organizations. And that is what we already see. That's already happening quite a lot. And you mentioned in the last episode, Paul LaRue, who is
the mastermind, I think the book is called.
Yeah. And
he was a prime example.
He's a prime example of somebody who was intelligent enough to use those technologies. I differ with the book in that I think that he wasn't actually a strategic thinker. I think it really becomes dangerous if you have strategic criminals employing those technologies and building organizations, because they don't make random mistakes that often.
Yeah, and he wasn't exactly refraining from violence. I mean, he was employing a lot of violence, not necessarily himself, but hiring a lot of people. And I think he got very greedy and did a lot of very high risky things, which were not really justified. But it kind of showed the way how basically one guy single-handedly could create like a criminal empire.
Yeah.
And it was more like the nerd computer kind of guy when he started. It wasn't like somebody growing up in a street crime environment, let's say.
And I think it becomes even more interesting when those high IQ criminals become developers of technology. What we have right now is this huge playground that is the world, plus a huge shopping mall that is called Shenzhen. And the combination of pretty high intelligence with readily available components and a wide world in which to deploy them gives a lot of interesting opportunities to hire intelligent, low morals people. So it's just a matter of time until more and more people realize that they can yield power in a way that has never before been possible to any human. And there's actually a term for that. And it's called Omni Violence.
So Omni Violence basically means when you look at the kill ratio, or the ratio of a killer to the people killed. So by the means of technology. So meaning how many people can you kill? Can one person kill? And with technological development increasing, we can reach a state of omniviolence where basically a single person can kill a lot of people.
Yeah.
And pose a systemic risk to countries or even the entire planet.
I think that it helps to visualize that a little bit. Nuclear devices will be one of the few devices that have a really high kill ratio. If you ignore that they have to be maintained, build, and it requires billions of euros to build something like that. Bioweapons are another example where basically one smart geneticist today can probably create something that kills hundreds of thousands of people. The same is true for a lot of other technologies. For example, if you're looking into robotic warfare, drones, etc., combined with biometrics, etc., you easily come into that field where a single human using off-the-shelf parts can create weapon systems that kill thousands of people. And if you compare that to a school shooter, that's, a gun is actually a weapon with a relatively low kill ratio. Per shot, it only has a relatively low probability of actually killing somebody. So the kill ratio is really about this one decision to act. and how many people do you kill from it. And guns are really bad at that, actually, because they have a kill ratio that is far below 1. So
because usually you have to fire quite a few bullets to actually kill someone.
Exactly. And even when it comes to airplanes and bombs dropped by airplanes, it's relatively few people compared to the number of personnel you use you need to actually deploy that airplane with a bomb. But when you're looking at modern technologies, especially autonomous weapons, etc., you only need a handful of people to kill thousands of others.
Which creates the threat of omniviolence, which is another thing combined with the threats we already discussed, which kind of poses the question to the state how they're going to deal with it.
Yeah. I think in the mission tasking of intelligence agencies, we probably already have omniviolence as a mission. It's just not public. There have been quite a few public writings about it recently. We'll mention them in the show notes, and there's no point of mentioning them now. But it's a threat that increasingly becomes realistic, and that is not very trivial to deal with. We're going to talk a little bit about what the state does later, but it's one of the things that are most likely going to shape the future. And I think we have very little understanding in general what is possible by current technology. And I think it helps to create a little bit of a picture here. There's a video that we will also link in the show notes that is relatively realistic of a group of people deploying little quadricopter drones, single shot, explosive inside with a shape charge, and facial recognition, where you actually upload a database of people that you want to have killed by that swarm. Then you release a few thousand of those in a single go, and they automatically search their target. Building something like that is completely realistic. So the micro quadricopters we have, you can order them in packs of thousands out of China. It's not a problem. When it comes to facial recognition technology, small facial recognition technology, that's easily available as well. So, for example, even if you go for very cheap integrated circuits like the ESP32, there's a development kit for face recognition in there that we jokingly transformed into a biometric mine recently. So a little camera that you can put anywhere, and it triggers not a real explosive, but like an LED in this case, as soon as a certain person comes by. And it's an $8 development kit. Like the hardware is $8, and it would be trivial to upgrade that to something that actually kills somebody. And this is just the very beginning of it. We have that with ground-based autonomous vehicles already. There's this toy, basically, by DJI, which is a little ground robot with a little, I think it's a air pressure gun, I think. And that has face recognition, object recognition, some autonomy features. And that is a toy for $500 right now. And
they actually sell it to help to train people, right? To train programmers.
It's one of those educational toys.
Yeah, which is really weird. I mean, I can easily see that go wrong.
I think add a few years, and one of those kids that had one as a 10, 12-year-old kid, then puberty comes, nihilism strikes, and then you upgrade the thing to actually kill people.
Yeah, or he has been bullied too much, and and this can really backfire. No pun intended.
I think it's safe to make the prediction that in the next 5 to 10 years, we will see the first autonomous robot school shooting somewhere on this planet. Or school killing. Let's not, restrict it to shooting only. And that's completely realistic, because there happen to be people out there that are relatively smart, and there happens to be a huge technological toolbox to select from. And given enough intelligence and enough energy, drive, and goals, you can be really dangerous these days. And there's a fascinating little thing that there has been a book released recently called Gefährliche Menschen, translated into Dangerous Criminals, I guess. It's only available...
Dangerous Humans.
Yeah. It's only available in German, I think. And it actually describes this near future dystopian world in which the whole system is focused around preventing omniviolence by people that just have a high IQ, that have a lot of energy, that have goals in their life. So I think it's a really good book to read, because these people actually exist, and some portion of those people will have low morals, low ethics, or might be just confused.
I think it's not just about preventing crimes per se, but it's also about that with a lot of tech and high IQ combined, you create things that destabilize the established system. I mean, even in a good way. So like you said in the book, it kind of pictures this future where the state kind of tries to control the development of technology and kind of captures most high IQ people into kind of boring and safe jobs, and then some of them, the dangerous humans, that kind of live on the fringes of society and do their own thing. But that's I think that's a very realistic way how the state tries to deal with the problem of omniviolence and the other ones we discussed so far, namely by trying to regulate technology.
I think there's one more thing I would throw in first on how to control potentially dangerous people. And that is completely non-popular opinion, but I think drugs is a big thing of that. I mean, you see that in the schools today. You have kids that are not adapted well to fit into the system because they're a little bit too energetic, a little bit too smart, a little bit too creative. And what you do with them today, you give them drugs. They're diagnosed as ADHD or whatever, and then you put drugs into them to calm them down, to pacify them. And if you're working in the tech industry, you know that as well, because there are so many people in the tech industry that self-medicate all the time.
Mm.
They're constantly on some kind of either medication or even illegal drug.
Mm.
I mean, how many people do I know that basically smoke one joint after the other because apparently they have real issues without it? They really needed to calm their mind and be able to stand the world, basically.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, that's most of what I saw going on in a lot of hacker spaces and hacker conferences. I kind of have this probably very unrealistic dream that all these smart people would actually sober up one day, go through the detox for a few weeks or months, and multiply their productivity by at least a factor of 10.
It's an unrealistic dream, I think.
Yeah, it's very unrealistic, but I think you're absolutely right. It's a ton of self-medication going on, probably also caused by a lot of bad schooling environment that wasn't really helping especially for people who don't fit in. I mean, that's the thing, that if people are exceptionally smart, they're also usually exceptionally not compatible with the mainstream. And so, they kind of have to be beaten in shape, so to speak.
Yeah.
And it kind of, is very destructive.
Yeah. I think there's even this issue of drugs being marketed as rebellion.
Sure.
And of course, everybody is rebellious, and the less you fit in, the more rebellious you become. And I think that exercising rebellion by taking drugs that don't help you to be an actual rebel and actually being effective is a pretty self-defeating thing. If I were an intelligence service, I would spread that idea of being high, being stoned is an act of rebellion by intelligent people. I would spread that idea far and wide. It lowers the threat dramatically.
Yeah. And there's also academia, which at least it used to be the clever people trap.
Yeah.
So, you kind of get them in there, and they have this idea that they're like doing research. It's really important and very sophisticated stuff that they're doing. And then they get this job for life, which is now a lot harder to get. But, and as long as they get, have a research topic which is not dangerous, you basically neutralized some clever person, and he's now spending the next 30 years researching a certain breed of butterflies, for example.
Which is apparently highly interesting to some people.
Yeah, I totally believe that it is, but there's a lot of BS going on there. A lot of wasted. That's
too much of a topic. Let's not go into ranting here. But that's kind of the bridge to how states deal with those more complex threats right now, and how they think about dealing with those threats in the future. And there are quite a few things that are already happening. I'm going to pick the one of those that have been most shocking to me, and that is also relatively simple, and that is preemptive detention. It has been a thing that is currently spreading through a lot of Western countries. One of them is Germany, where if the police identifies you as a potential criminal, they can lock you up for a certain amount of time without a judge actually having to agree to that. And they then can renew that with a judge agreeing to them. But essentially, we're talking about locking people up that might become criminals. All you need is a more or less justified suspicion that if I lock this person up, I can prevent crime in the near future. That's all you have to do. And similar...
It's a thing that has been going on many years ago already for hooligans, right? If you're like wearing...
Travel bans.
Yeah, travel bans, right.
Well, in the past, travel bans, yeah, that's probably how it started. But we also had the psychiatric detention that was often used to silence people and put them away. So you make up some shit about that person and you put him away. And there has been actually a pretty prominent case in Germany recently. I sadly forgot the name of the dude, but he accused the bank for which his wife worked of supporting money laundering and tax evasion. And as a result, there was a conspiracy basically between state security, police, psychiatric personnel, etc., to lock him up for, I think, a decade and to undermine his witness. And he only recently, I think 1 or 2 years ago, he actually won a court case against the system and actually got out. And by now he's really mental, after 10 years in psychiatric hospital, probably everybody is mental. But he won the case and got out. And that has been a strategy in the past to make up, these kinds of stories to get people into psychiatric care involuntarily. But what shocked me about the development with the new preemptive detention laws is that they don't even make up excuses anymore. But instead they write a law that says, I'm gonna limit your liberty because you might commit a crime in the near future. And
which basically is totally arbitrary. I mean, how do you determine that, right?
It's totally arbitrary, and it has these huge consequences for people. Most people, if they would be locked up for a month or 2 or 3, they would lose their job. They would have huge social damages, etc. And for the state to think that is a good idea, I was really shocked when the Bavarian government introduced this. That was one of those moments where I thought, I really have to get out of Germany.
Yeah, it's just not so clear where to go.
Yeah, different topic, but yeah. What else do states do? Let's go into more complex aspects. I think one that most of us know about is surveillance. We are living in a time and age where surveillance is omnipresent, and which has, of course, to do with how we communicate, that we're infusing everything with digital technology, so it's much easier to surveil us. Facial recognition, video cameras, etc., much easier. Digital payments, credit cards, easier. Number plate recognition is much easier because of technology. And of course, when it comes to the growth of surveillance, one big part is commercial interest. People are interested in the data they can collect, so they can predict what we're gonna buy in the future, or manipulate how we make decisions in the future. Plus, there's this huge aspect of using surveillance data for AI training, where all the data that we get, we run through neural networks and then hope that we become really smart in that. It starts with trying to use health data to predict illnesses, but also training AI, for example, in recognizing behavior, predicting behavior, etc. And that is where the overlap to surveillance as a security tool comes into play, where nation states are widely collecting data to find hints at what crimes could potentially be committed in the future, plus resolve the attribution issue of a lot of crimes. And in a way, it's the default mode of what nation states today do to increase their security status, is to just surveil the shit out of everything.
Mm. And I think that's definitely an international trend. You can see that everywhere.
Yeah, there are probably no countries that really that really say stop to that. I mean, of course, there are a few things right now happening that are kind of interesting in that regard. That is, there are quite a few proposals on banning or regulating face recognition. And I think the EU and some states in the US are actually thinking about having a moratorium on face recognition, basically saying we won't use it for the next 5 years or something, which I actually think has less to do with the actual threat of face recognition, but more with face recognition not catching all the right people. I think there's a lot of racist and anti-racist motivation behind those controlling face recognition. If you rely too much on face recognition today, there will be a lot of people with darker skin that would be falsely or not at all identified. And I think that's in conflict with a lot of politics today.
Because the recognition doesn't work so well.
Yeah, a lot of the training sets for face recognition AIs is biased towards using predominantly light skin samples. And the other thing is that the sensors simply don't work that well with darker skin because
less contrast.
Yeah, there's less contrast, shadows falls differently and so on. And that makes automatic face recognition, it doesn't target everybody in the same way, both in the positive and the negative. And I think that is potentially risky because people might be accused of racial bias, etc. And I think that is one of the big reasons why they're dropping it. Because if you look, and that is one of the reasons. I think the second reason is that it's an easy thing to give up because of the commercial dominance in the field already. You can just hire companies doing the work for you.
Yeah, what's the story with this face recognition app in the US?
Clearview AI.
Yeah, Clearview AI, basically where they can outsource all the work to a private company and just buy their services, and that way get around some regulations.
And that has happened quite a few times already. There has been this Russian app that basically on the street you make a picture of somebody and you can automatically find their social media site on VKontakte. And there have also been quite a lot of how you call it, face recognition spiders on the internet. So, for example, identifying adult actors, is that the correct word? Like porn stars in videos, and then finding out their true identities and stuff like that. So in a way, all these, we're going to buy face recognition is in a way bullshit because it's already there. It's not going to be regulated at all.
Yeah, but I think it's almost also a little bit of a desperate attempt by the regulators that they also see that technologies are progressing. It gives them developments that they like. It gives them developments they don't like. So they kind of often, without a clear plan, try to navigate the landscape through regulation. I think we can see a lot of that in the drone sector, where there's like a lot of new regulations that came up. At the same time, the regulators also see that there's a ton of commercial potential that they want to see realized.
Yeah, but they're also afraid of the potential negative aspects quite a lot.
Oh, yeah.
I think that tech regulation, I mean, in drones, you see that very well right now because of the new FAA regulations in the US, which basically boil down to the government wanting a kill switch for all drones, which a lot of our friends in the underground tech world are going to widely ignore. But where you have this idea that at least for consumer grade technology, the government wants to stay in control. And I think that's a really important point to make when it comes to tech regulation. Tech regulation doesn't really target the specialist. It doesn't target the high IQ criminal. It's against the random criminal. The normal IQ criminal that is just enabled by technology. So it's the same thing that we see in regulation for cryptography. Nobody's going to be able to take the knowledge of cryptography off the market. And I don't think that anybody expect that they could. Also, I'm very sure that nobody expects that they're able to take software development kits and libraries off the market. That's not going to happen. But what you can do is you can prevent complete easy-to-use software to become the default. And I think that's where a lot of those attempts to regulate WhatsApp and Signal and all that come from. Is they just want to make sure that the random folk don't have access to good cryptography.
Yeah, it just increases the cost a lot. And of course, if you're smart and or motivated, you can get around that. But for the average Joe, you make it much, much harder. So it's it's less likely that he will actually use that technology.
Though even for relatively smart and motivated people, it's really hard to get around that. Because implementing cryptographic systems by people that are not specialized in that usually goes wrong. It's really hard to build secure cryptographic software, even with libraries out there, etc. So regulating off-the-shelf products is really effective in preventing huge amounts of the population from having access to secure communications.
Sure, and I mean it's the same for drones because the regulated consumer products, they're the ones that will actually deliver most of the value, so to say, at a low price point. So if you want to circumvent the regulations, that means your costs it's not just going to increase by the effort you have to put in to circumvent the regulations. You also go away from the consumer products, go into more specialized products or into, building from components, which makes everything more expensive. And as you can also see there, as you can see from the war on drugs, where they're also now regulating precursors, the same will happen with, let's say, drones or 3D printing, where they will put regulations on the precursors. So let's say engines or 3D printing materials and stuff like that, so that you have a harder time building an unregulated or let's say unhampered drone from scratch.
Yeah.
Or stuff like that, or print a 3D weapon which is not traceable, for example, if most of the precursors are already tagged.
Well, we already see that with so many chemicals. If I just compare what chemicals I could buy as a teenager, just going to the pharmacy and ordering sulfuric acid, for example, doing that today is so much harder, and it will most likely lead to a notification to some police force that says, hey, smuggler bought these 2 acids and starch today. Maybe visit him. He might be building a bomb. A lot of these sales controls are already in effect. And I think that will be one of the defining things about how the state is going to try to increase security in the future, is to actually regulate technology by both regulating components and chemicals and stuff like that, and trying to regulate knowledge as well.
I think it's important to kind of paint the full dystopian vision here. Like the papers you mentioned, which we're going to put in the show notes, which deal with omniviolence. They have this, they paint this vision of how we're going to prevent omniviolence.
Mm-hmm.
And the way they see it is we're going to prevent omniviolence basically by total surveillance.
Combined with AI.
Yeah. Of everybody all the time. So that the moment you kind of start fiddling with your A-bomb or DNA kit at home, the surveillance streams will be detecting it.
Yeah.
And when I read that paper for the first time, I was kind of very startled that they think, because they call it like these black ball events. So like a black ball event is something which kind of can kill the entire humanity.
Threatens civilization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it threatens this survival of humanity or civilization with one single event or technology. And like I said, the way they want to prevent that is basically creating this complete panopticon where they prevent anyone from building such a tech.
Yeah.
Although to me,
without them actually knowing what those techs are.
Yeah.
That is kind of the important aspect, because what they're really doing is anomaly detection. They're not just detecting actual threats, but they're looking at anomalies.
Yeah, and then you have these people looking at, controlling the AI, and somehow you still have to control them. And for me, it was very absurd, because I think, okay, I thought once you build that system successfully, you already have your black ball event. It kind of is the end of civilization, or, because there is no creativity anymore. There is no freedom anymore at all.
Yeah, it's the age-old question of if living is the same as having something to live for. I think that for securocrats, a lot of decisions are based on body count and not on the quality of life at all. That's why I think a lot of these security measures today are cattle management. They don't care if you are happy, if you can express yourself, and all these things. They don't care about that. They only care about if they count the cattle, that it's not dramatically less than with the last count. I think that's more or less how you can break down their thinking.
I think I would go further than that. I mean, when you're managing cattle, you're not just interested in the amount of cattle you have. You're also interested in the product. So you want to maximize the product. The product, however, is not the happiness of the cattle. It's what the cattle produces. So as long as your cattle lives and, like going to humans, consumes and pays taxes, that's all you need. That's what you want to maximize.
So you're much more cynical than I am.
No, I'm just realistic.
Yeah, maybe.
But it's not about happiness or, like some lofty philosophical goal where you contribute to the advancement of human knowledge.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know that. But of course,
but these are like these papers. These are leading academics, right? Writing.
Yes. Yeah. Oxford, I think.
Yeah.
Oxford professors.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things there is that if you do anomaly detection and you're interested in the product created by the cattle, those are conflicting goals, because the product is so dependent on the creativity of the cattle. And if you undermine the creativity of people by punishing or at least becoming suspicious at them the moment they're a little bit creative and thinking outside the box, you're not getting any good product anymore.
But I mean, these are second order effects. It's like with normal cattle management.
Oh, right.
Right. First, you kind of cram them all into these like very efficient small spaces. And then later it turns out, it kind of drives up stress and has all these other problems. And then you kind of mitigate them with more antibiotics. It's the same with humans, put some VR goggles on and then these depression rates will maybe be manageable. Okay, I have a cynical day today.
Well, you have. But I think that these two aspects, like surveillance with AI to control technology and behavior, is probably one of the two biggest things to come in the future. And I mean, we talked about that off air a lot of times, that there's also this training people into becoming less creative and preventing people that are too creative, too intelligent from actually getting anywhere in life. So the school system is a good example for that. If you're not well adapted to their system, then you're going to fail. And it will have huge consequences on the rest of your life. And what I actually expect over time to develop more is something that I would call Cambridge Analytica for the masses, where psychoanalytic, like digital psychoanalytic technologies, psychography, are going to be used on humans much more. Like finding out how they make decisions, finding out how they react in certain situations, to be able to give them a psychological score, and to use that not just for marketing and not just for election hampering or whatever, but potentially also to figure out which people are more trustworthy to have access to certain technologies or travel or etc. than others. And you kind of have that a little bit already when you look at China, where you have the first experiments of creating a social scoring system, which mostly today is still reactive. So it requires you to do something good or bad, whatever, to modify your score. So there's no true predictive element in it yet. But we have those predictive technologies in other fields already. So when it comes, for example, to sentencing rules in the US, there are quite a few experiments going on there with automatic sentencing, where basically predictive algorithms are used to decide how long somebody should be in jail because of their psychology and biography, etc. And when you consider those things merging, predictive algorithms and reactive social score, with all the enforcement that is already in there, like in China, where if you have a bad score, you cannot use a high-speed rail or you cannot get a bank account, etc. That might be an extremely effective way of ruining people's lives.
And that might also be a way to solve, in quotes, the creativity problem. You kind of detect people who are outside the norm of their behavior, and then kind of categorize them in, let's say, the good ones and the bad ones. You know, the good ones being there, like, let's say, more creative, more thinking, more outside of the box than the others, but they're still adjusted enough to bring society forward. And to them, you give, let's say, certain technologies, or you give them certain opportunities how to experiment. And the bad ones, it would be like going back to the book you mentioned earlier, the
like
danger.
You and me. Like you and me, the bad ones.
The bad ones, exactly. The dangerous humans, you kind of restrict them from technology.
Yeah.
I think, wasn't that also the theme in like Ender's Game, where they were selecting pilots for,
I don't know.
It's been a long time. But I think it was a similar thing there, that they kind of had these game simulations where they were looking for really good pilots, and then selected for that.
I think that for a lot of people, what we're talking about now it sounds a lot like conspiracy theory. People cannot imagine that the system would ever do something like that. But the interesting thing is that the mechanisms are already there for licensing. So today, if you want to for example, run a money transmitting service, you have to get a license from whatever the banking regulator is. And part of that license is that very questionable term of being a reliable individual. Or when you want to get a gun license, you have to be healthy in body and mind and a reliable person. So we have those licensing by personality already. And the only question is, where does the score comes from? Where does the guess come from? How reliable you are? So right now, it's a lot about, do you have a criminal record and stuff like that? But there's nothing that speaks against using predictive analytics for that. We're using it in every other way already. You know, when it comes to credit score and all that, we're already using predictive algorithms for that. So I think it's completely realistic to use more and more of that in the licensing field and make licensing a much less human-involved bureaucratic process, and instead making it a pervasive, everywhere, more or less automatic process.
Yeah, that would be exactly what I said about, regulating creative people. You either get the license when your compliance score is high enough, or you don't get the license.
Yeah. And it's not unrealistic to do. It's not a big change of the methods they already use. It's not a big change from the regulation they already have. It's basically the same thing, just advanced by modern technology.
Yeah, so, of course. I mean, I think you have that in law, right? Once you committed a crime, you cannot become a lawyer. You have that in medicine when you did some malpractice or some other stuff, then you cannot become a doctor.
Right, but those are all reactive scores.
But I mean, even there, let's say I know it for pilot licenses. If you want to get a pilot license, but you have a lot of
drinking issue.
No, they look at your driver's license, and we have this point system in Germany, and if you have a lot of points,
you can't get a license.
And an amount of driving infractions which do not lead to you losing your driver's license, you will still not get a pilot license, because they say, oh yeah, you're not even, you're not driving safely enough for us to give you a pilot license.
Yeah,
that's already an issue.
Yeah.
So, or I think with weapons it's the same. If you lose your driver's license for, let's say, drunk driving, which they consider irresponsible behavior, then you wouldn't get a weapon license. So, and which is like a crude mechanism of this predictive regulation already, right. And it's just one more step to.
And since we're all for e-government these days, it's just a question of time until we use AI to do those processes without human involvement or judgment.
And the population is voting for the wrong things anyway.
Exactly.
So better help them along. But like you said, I mean, it's very easy to see this as very conspiracy nutty thinking. And, but like you also said, the technology is already there. And I think a lot of the stuff we kind of fear about the future, we can kind of see it
it's already there.
In a petri dish, no pun intended. In a petri dish in Wuhan right now and other parts of China. Where I think they're deploying a lot of these surveillance technologies and measures. I mean, they've been deploying them already before, but now they're really cranking it up while trying to get this epidemic under control.
Yeah, and essentially it's a state that is under pressure, or not under pressure, but experiencing a stressor event where they really have to react to both protect the people and limit the fallout for themselves, etc. So the thing that's happening there is compared to an omniviolence scenario is nothing. You know, it's very sad and sorry for all those people infected and dying maybe, but the scale there is relatively small compared to what an omniviolence event would actually bring with it. And the amount of methods and the reach of methods they're already employing is enormous. And it starts from these locking down neighborhoods and basically preventing you from traveling within the city unless you have the right identity papers, to using drones to measure the temperature of people, to check if they're wearing masks, using CCTV cameras to check if people are wearing masks or show symptoms, but also using like booking details to find out who was in the same train or the same plane or whatever than somebody who is potentially infected. And they combine all of these technologies to essentially create a laboratory for surveillance and enforcement technologies.
Yeah, and I think they can already see this total surveillance aspect that what you said about the bookings, where they kind of dial back on history and look at here, this person is infected now. Who was he in contact with? And it's not like old school asking the person. It's basically going through the data trail, seeing, oh yeah, he was sitting next to these people, so we kind of have to warn them or check on them. And
not just booking data, but also like location tracking data.
Yeah. And also kind of projecting that into the future, you know, like you said, automatic temperature checks. And, I mean, it's not far-fetched to do things like, okay, you know, sneeze detection, for example, you know, okay, this person, or like even stress signals.
Sweat is probably relatively easy to detect, actually.
People who are more likely to get infected by their general health status, stress level, other biomarkers. And, so like you said, they're already deploying a ton of these methods, and, for a lot smaller scenario.
Yeah.
And my fear is that in general, and we will see that in the West as well, I believe, when the infections are spreading here, if they are spreading here as well, in bigger numbers, that this will be used to roll out a lot of methods some people had in their drawers for a long time, and in the name of, you know, improving the containing the pandemic, but to, you know, reach other political goals.
Yeah, it's kind of frightening if you make the list of all the things they're doing there already. So you have, to the outside, you have the Great Firewall of China, you have censorship, all that stuff. You have manipulation of media. You have CCTV, automatic tracking, anomaly detection. If somebody's coughing, you can detect that. If somebody falls, you can detect that. Measuring of temperature, flying drones into courtyards to find people, all of that. But also, like, restricting cash out, telling people that they can only go to the street on a certain day of the week, and to reduce the density of people that could go out, and then enforcing that, for example, by blocking their ATM cards. So you can't go to the ATM to withdraw money on a day you shouldn't be out of the house, and stuff like that. So in a way, China is not actually a highly technologically dependent society yet. The necessity for technology in China is not that extreme for most people, especially when you're a little bit out of the international centers. But them employing everything that they have already and creating a more or less dystopian prison of the size of a multi-million inhabitant city is at least as frightening as any idea of whatever pandemic could happen or could not happen. And simply this experimenting and rolling out of all that technology, arming it against the people is quite extreme.
And it also kind of, I'm going a bit on a tangent here, but touching on the future of warfare. I mean, this is how you basically, if you conquer a foreign city, this is how you control the population, combined with a few more autonomous weapon systems. But that's basically how you can do it with very little human power necessary. So it's again, like, it's not a kill ratio, but it's like a control ratio.
Yeah.
The amount of people you need to control a huge population is going down and down with the help of technology.
Yeah. I think it's, maybe Wuhan is not the best example for that yet, but when you look at the current conflict between Turkey and Syria in the Idlib region, we have Turkey deploying those semi-autonomous aerial control systems already. Basically, it's little stations of granite launchers that are positioned at key points in the countryside and on streets. And they automatically make sure that their surrounding is free of humans. They are able to automatically engage with humans and shoot them, basically. And those stations are relatively small. They're about the size of a fridge and can be easily deployed. They're slightly armored, so you cannot actually shoot them out with a rifle or something. And if you imagine something like that happening in a bigger city, where you put a station like that on every major intersection or on a high rise, etc., then it would be suicide to leave the house. You can basically turn even a huge city within hours, at maximum a few days, into a place where nobody can leave the house, and where only a couple of hundred of special operators are required to control a multi-million inhabitant city like Wuhan or Berlin or something like that. And where the attack itself would be very sneaky. It could happen basically in a night. You deploy the Spec Ops people with those autonomous systems. They spread through the city, install the systems, then you switch them on early in the morning and tell everybody stay inside or you'll be dead. And then nothing works. I mean, police doesn't work, military will have issues, etc. And that is only aerial denial systems. And then you add all the aspects of autonomous drones, both ground-based and flying, like UAVs and UGVs and USVs, where you can, for example, there are these automatic patrol bots that Korea has been using forever to control the border between South and North Korea, where automatic targeting is an activatable option if the North Koreans ever attack South Korea. And these systems are basically mobile. They can drive through the countryside and search for potential targets, and then ask the operator, may I shoot that person? And so that is already long existing. And when you look at UAVs, drones, we have that already, the autonomous suicide drones, is how they're called, or loitering munitions, where you basically have a drone that is staying in the air and waiting for a target. And then when it sees the target, it flies itself into the target and explodes. And these systems become cheaper and cheaper and smaller and more powerful in a sense, every day. I think it was today or yesterday, where Germany declared artificial intelligence to be a critical defense technology, which translated means a critical weapons technology for killing people. And that is probably the future of war, is using a bunch of those systems at the same time. Suicide drones, aerial control, roving robots, and very few special operators to control and maintain that. But basically, it's going to be armed technicians that will be stationed. And then very few people, very little money will be enough to take cities hostage.
Man, that's a bleak picture.
Yeah, kind of is. Well, that was a nice episode.
The next part, we're gonna have some more positive visions for the future, hopefully.
We'll see.
Well, after ending on that bleak note, it's time for something more exciting or uplifting, and that is our donation report. This time we have, I think for the first time, the donations reported not in Bitcoin, but in Monero. Because we got a single donation of 41.69 Monero, which honestly blew my socks off.
Yeah, I had to ask you, I don't know, 5-6 times until I was sure that you weren't joking about that.
Yeah, I already calculated it 3 times, because I had to look up the exchange rate and calculated it 3 times, and then in the end had to send Smuggler a screenshot of the wallet for him to believe me. So, yeah, whoever that generous donor was,
thank you.
Thanks a lot. We really appreciate it. We appreciate every donation, big and small. It's really important for us to, be able to keep going. And also it's great to see that it provides value for people, and, it's not just rambling. So yeah, that was the Monero donations. We also got, 2.43 Monero in Bitcoin, 0.71 Monero in Bitcoin Cash, 0.47 Monero in Zcash. I think for the first time some Zcash here. 0.22 Monero in Decred. And we also got 0.08 Monero in Indian rupees. Somebody sent us a really nice letter with a
hand-drawn card, yeah,
from India. So that was,
we loved that.
We really loved that.
We had a drink together and had the card deeply appreciated, and it's actually going to be in our shrine for stuff we get from our listeners.
Yeah, I think we're not going to exchange the rupees for now, and just, create a collage of the postcards and dirty fiat you send us. So we mentioned in other shows, so you can actually send us letters, postcards, and your dirty fiat in the mail. We would also love some books. The address is in the show notes on our page, which is tas0.org/bitstream. And we also have a new option to contact us and discuss. Maybe Smuggler, you want to say something about that?
Yeah, we started an online forum. It's called Async Pre, and it's located at bbs.anaplex.net. We have a special section that is just about the podcast, where you can register questions, drop us comments, wishes, everything. And where we also hope to have the opportunity to go into a few topics more with you, our listener, and maybe develop something like a knowledge base on a few topics. So please sign up at bbs.anaplex.net and let's build something together there.
Cool. And as always, you can also send us an email at bitstream@taz0.org. You can also encrypt it with PGP. The key is also on our website. I also wanted to say that we really appreciate all the emails we're getting, all the feedback. We do read every single email, although we do not reply to every single email. But we try to, gather the questions from email, from the forum, from Twitter, and answer them also in the show, which is what we're going to do now. We're going to have basically a question section and go through some of the questions we received. And I'm just going to start with one from the forum, which was, how would the average aspiring second realmer get their NIM used in legal documents or at their workplace? Is this a realistic goal?
That really depends on your circumstance and on your environment. Depending on your jurisdiction, you might not actually have a legal requirement to identify you with a real name. However, in most jurisdictions, you have to because of tax reasons. And the only approach I know there that kind of works is if you don't get employed as a natural person, but as a company. So instead of being a normal human that signs the contract with your employer, you make the deal with your employer that you're a subcontractor, and you have a company that is the legal front for you. And that way, it's not you as a person necessarily that is on the books, but it's the company that is fronting you.
Yeah, if you're in a lucky situation that the person employing you or giving you the contract is able to pay you in crypto, you could even go for like an anonymous environment corporation, something like that, and stay completely anonymous.
And it really also depends on the kind of job you have. There are quite a lot of jobs that are, let me say, paid by cash and not recorded well. If you're in construction or restaurant business, etc., it's quite normal that employment is a very unofficial matter in the first place. So just show up there with your NIM and nobody's going to ask you for your passport.
Yeah, I think it really also depends on the industry you're in. And I've been working for a company as a contractor, and I think most of the people in a company don't know my legal name.
Yeah.
They probably don't even know that I'm using a NIM, but
they know that you're working there, right?
They know that I'm working there, yes. And the person I did the contract with and the person who does the handles invoices, they know, because the invoices come from identifiable sources, but other people don't know. And when I talk to people on the outside, then they also don't know. It really depends what you're trying to protect. I think we touched on it before. I think this whole NIM thing, it's a lot of psychological problems people seem to have there. I mean, if you let's say you have a computer science background, then maybe it's easier for you to grasp. It's just really just a pointer. A name is just a pointer. There's only one you, and you can create as many pointers to that person as you want. And there's not really nothing special about the first pointer your parents gave you, you know?
Well, it's probably lower on the stack, higher on the stack, but never mind.
Index 0.
Index 0. But I think that one of the things to keep in mind is that having more anonymity is something that comes with also being more autonomous, and vice versa. It's much easier to protect your privacy if you're an entrepreneur and not a wage slave. So it's often hard to have both sides of, having the cake and eating it too. You either want to plug into the system with all the welfare and all the benefits and the business suit and the perks that come with it. And that usually comes with a price. And the price is less autonomy and less privacy. And if you want more privacy, then the way to go is probably to be an entrepreneur and to also think a little bit more outside of the box. You don't have to work in the same jurisdiction as the company you are handling, for example. And you don't necessarily have to do everything by bank account and wire transfer. There's options for cash usually. Even today, when you're working for a company, there are ways to get paid in cash, and then you just have to sign a receipt, or you receive cryptocurrency, or you have an offshore bank account. And the other thing to consider is to actually become part of a worker pool company where multiple people like you are sharing one company and hiring themselves out as freelancers through a central company, which also drives down management costs, etc. But it requires a little bit of effort to set up. So
yeah, I was just want to say that basically you create like a front company that does the actual contracting, and you either invoice, you're employed by that company or you invoice that company. And I mean, when you look at these business relationships, people who are contracting other companies, they don't usually give a shit about the names of the people working for the company.
Exactly.
And they never question the names. So, that's totally doable, either through a more anonymous corporation or just have one person basically identifying and handling that front company. And you could even like have your own company, but have it invoice that front company.
Yeah.
And nothing of that, by the way, I mean, none of that is, if you do it correctly, it's illegal in any form. As long as you're not defrauding people, that's totally fine.
Yeah. And the other thing to mention, of course, is if you really want to get second realm all the way, then we're talking about black market here and not about companies, etc. Then you're working completely outside of the system.
Exactly. Then you receive cryptocurrencies and you do your job under a pseudonym.
Or cash.
Yeah.
Never forget cash. We got rupees as well, so please.
Which was kind of funny with this big donation we got in Monero, because that was the only currency where our listeners couldn't even verify that what we just said is right or wrong. I mean, except for the person who sent the money, nobody knew about it. Yeah. And but we decided to stick to our plan and report our donations faithfully.
Just don't stop donating.
Yeah, please. Otherwise, we're dependent on one person. That would be bad for the future of the podcast. But anyway, I think that covered that question. We have a second one from the forum as well. I'd really like to see you guys cover the art of clandestine purchasing. For example, do 3D printers have hidden tracking codes like paper printers? Discussing details on acquiring something like this with a prepaid credit card and how to ship it to a non-attributable address would be cool.
So far, most 3D printers that you buy, well, the 3D printers themselves don't have identifying marks that are registered so far. Of course, they have a fingerprint more or less that exists by the nozzle and inconsistencies of the control. But the real thing to look at is the materials. And so far, there has not been a standard for spiking materials with identifiers. there have been proposals for that, for sure. And there are probably some companies experimenting with that. But usually what you do, you go to your 3D print shop or you order it directly from China. So getting materials without tracers embedded is not a problem today. It might become one in the future, but right now it doesn't widely exist.
The second part wasn't mentioned yet, but I just gonna read the next question, which is very similar. One issue that I always find very hard is receiving shipments by mail, not necessarily very illegal items, but maybe items you just don't want to receive at an attributable address and that are larger than what fits in a standard letterbox. How to receive things in another name and where with the least amount of trouble and risk.
Okay, so the ordering process of bigger items. Prepaid credit cards are, for more expensive items, are not widely available outside of the US. But what you can usually get is vouchers for Amazon, etc. So
which you now can get through cryptos as well.
Exactly. So you can use something like Bitrefill to get an Amazon voucher and then order the stuff through Amazon, which works pretty well, actually. I've done that a couple of times in the past, and it also works with new accounts. So not just with accounts that had a credit card already, but it works with new accounts as well. Then receiving that is potentially complicated because live drops that you would require to receive a package are highly dependent on your environment and your needs. So in Germany, one thing that has been used a lot is to use stolen identifiers for so-called Paketboxen. So the German mail system can deliver parcels to little machines that are basically safe deposit boxes and that are placed in shopping malls and similar. And you have a little identifier code to open that and get your parcel out. There is a wide trade on the darknet for those identifiers. And if the person you are ordering from supports tracking and all that stuff, it's usually relatively easy to get that to a location like that. The other thing is that you could have a real live drop that is a cafe or a club or a shop or similar, where you redirected package to, and where you maybe even be able to give that address directly, and then you just pick it up. It really depends on how good your relationships to those people are. Then you can abuse hotels for receiving larger packages. So if you're a guest in a hotel, they usually accept shipments for you. And not all hotels require you signing up with a real name. And especially if you're able to use Vanity ID, you can make that process work pretty much everywhere. And it means that you order the stuff to the hotel and book a room for the expected delivery date, then basically just send an email to the hotel and say, hey, I'm expecting a parcel, and then it will usually work. Then they store it for you. You just pick it up. And in addition, you have a nice stay at a hotel for a night or two. And then, of course, you can always hijack elements of the postal system. So, for example, if you already have the ability to receive letters somewhere, you have an address, then just putting a sticker on the letterbox saying, please drop all packages in the shop next door, usually works really well. That's my preferred method. It means that most of the packages are actually delivered to a small corner shop, etc. You get a little slip. You go there, present the slip, maybe have to do a signature. I never had to show my ID for it so far. And I think in a lot of cases, using vanity ID there works as well.
Cool. Another question we got from the forum was how to beat facial recognition during drop operations and otherwise. What methods are effective? How often worn outside of the TDZ?
That is the undead question of all questions, because we get that a million times and there's no nice answer for that. The only thing that really works are wide coverage masks for your face. So you have to at least cover your eyes, including the eyebrows, the root, the stem, and the tip of your nose, at least your face, and ideally your chin. And so the reason for that is that facial recognition technology today, they are based on detecting characteristics of your face, basically points of your face and their distances. And the detection works by using that vector of points and calculating the Euclidean distance to a template. That is you. And that means that depending on how big the database is, they can recognize you with very few points. So even if you're wearing sunglasses, those sunglasses maybe only cover like 10 or 15 points of the face template, and all the other 100 something points will still be recognizable. So that's still precise enough to, with a limited database, find the Euclidean distance to you quite easily. And that means that you have to cover most of your face to get out of facial recognition. So the minimum to have is a face that, a mask that covers the lower part of your face, including most of your nose, and big sunglasses. It also makes sense to introduce shadow to your face, like with a base cap is similar, because that reduces the precision of point detection. And that's basically how you have to go these days.
And ideally, you would also cover your ears.
Cover your ears. Don't leave fingerprints. So that's another thing often forgotten, is to not wear gloves. That's a very good thing. If you're wearing gloves, make them black, ideally, and make them a little bit too big for your hand, so you can reduce the precision of hand geometry measurements.
Cool. We also got a few questions from Twitter. One was how to go into Darknet, VirtualBox and Tor, which OS?
The standard approach that is good practice is to just use Tails. So Tails is this Linux distribution that you can just install on a USB stick that per default doesn't write any data to storage. And that's a good way to experiment with it. You can't do much wrong. If you're a little bit more comfortable, then yes, the idea would be to have a virtual machine, ideally one that you store in an encrypted device, just in case, that is using NAT as the network interface. So that means that the VirtualBox or virtual machine doesn't see its real local IP address, but a stand-in IP address, and then use either Tails on it or some other Linux distribution. And a good practice there is to have multiple hard disks in the virtual machine, one for data that you want to keep and one for everything else. And then use snapshotting to prevent the virtual machine to have persistent changes. So there's a snapshot feature in a lot of virtual machine products, like in VirtualBox, where you can basically always revert to the same snapshot. And that way you make it much harder to accidentally have identifying information stored on the device too often.
Similar to what Tails does, that it's doesn't have persistent data.
Yeah.
Cool. Another question from Twitter. In terms of cyber warfare, which state or state proxy has the most technical capacity for attacks and defense?
That's such a complex question. I think that's really hard to answer. From history, there are 3 really big players in that field when it comes to attack. That is the United States, often with their friend Israel, sometimes with Canada, etc. So that is a big player in attacks. So Stuxnet was likely a project by the US and Israel. Then another big player is China. China is brutally efficient when it comes to cyber attacks. They're really good at that. And they're probably better than the Russians, which I would consider number 3 when it comes to offensive capabilities shown in the wild. Now, there's a big blind field on actors that we don't have good attribution to, because attribution in cyber warfare is really, it doesn't really work. I mean, most of the reports who did what are not even educated guesses. They're more political statements than anything else. There's almost no technical evidence that you can really gather. And most of the offensive cyber warfare stuff is highly secret. So it's very likely that there are advanced state capabilities that we haven't seen in the wild much. So, for example, I suspect that there's quite some capability out of India that we've never seen in the wild. And there are, of course, also actors that are not state actors. So it's questionable if cyber warfare is really the right term to use there. But a lot of Eastern Europe, quite a lot of Asia, has actors that are quite competitive there. And of course, there are international actors in that field. But most of these organizations don't have a marketing department. So we don't really know, not necessarily who they are, but there are no real names for them. They don't have brands. So that's on the offensive side. On the defensive side, there are 2 aspects to consider there. That is the ability for active defense, like preventing attacks and hindering attacks. And then there's the question of vulnerability. That is, how much damage can an attacker actually yield on you? And those 2 come together when it comes to defense. Very vulnerable is most of the West. America, Europe are very vulnerable because of technological dependence. And they would easily fall prey to cyber warfare in a large scale. Countries like North Korea have very little to fear from cyber warfare because most people there don't use technical systems that are internet connected. We're really unsure how this will develop, because what a lot of countries are thinking about today is to limit the paths of attack in that field. Russia, China, Iran, etc. They use their big firewalls both for censorship and preventing cyber attacks. And if that is really if that's going to work really is highly questionable, but we simply don't know. We never had a full-blown cyber war. And we don't actually know which strategies to defend really work. So I think it's an unanswerable question. Who's best in defense there?
Yeah, it seems to be that currently you're most, like I said, with North Korea, you're most defensible when you're not that much developed.
Yeah,
just by being less vulnerable. But I agree with you that it's largely an unknown how this would play out. It's going to be very interesting, and I'm afraid it's going to be devastating.
It likely will. And the interesting thing is that North Korea is an actual interesting aspect when it comes to cyber warfare, or let's say cyber-backed technological warfare, because of this relatively low development that they have locally, but they also have no problem with buying people that work for them, and getting people from China, getting people from all over the world to work in their offensive cyber operations. And then there's this whole aspect that for North Korea, cyber operations have become a big economic factor, where their sanction busting is to a certain degree focused on using cyber fraud to get currency, also cryptocurrency mining, etc. So there's a lot of exploiting of the cyber world going on by the North Korean regime, not necessarily operated by North Korean personnel. Plus, there's this bet of North Korea against the West when it comes to devastating technological attacks. So the main focus of the North Korean nuclear weapons program is actually not to have a weapon explode in Los Angeles. That's not what they want.
Right?
It's EMPs.
Yeah.
So they're more considering getting a warhead out of the atmosphere and exploding it so that an electromagnetic shockwave fries everything in the footprint of that explosion. And that also makes the weapon systems much cheaper, because you only have to get them up, but you don't have to be able to re-enter the atmosphere, which is quite challenging because of heat and all these things.
And depending on where you ignited, the pulse transmits very far, right?
Yeah, you have this issue with EMPs that the footprint is not like the geographic footprint. So it's not you explode it in the sky and below it everything fries. Well, partially yes, but the accelerated particles follow the magnetic field of the Earth. So if you have a good map of the magnetic fields of the Earth, you can target quite well and over relatively high distances. And it seems that is more or less what North Korea is looking at.
Cool. Further question, thoughts on accelerationism, and maybe before you answer, define what that actually means.
Okay. Accelerationism is this idea that political change, revolution, whatever, should be acquired by making the situation of the current system worse, so it breaks, and then we change it. It's so for example, if you think that global warming is a real issue, the accelerationist approach there would be to make it so much worse that the effects are visible to everybody and governments fall over it, etc. And then you can start saving the planet.
So if you have a drinking problem, you drink more.
So you really hate it afterwards.
Okay.
So that is the idea of accelerationism, is to make systems break faster.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think that's a bad idea. For systemic reasons and for ethical reasons. Most accelerationist activity would result in a lot of suffering and victims. That's one thing. And the other thing is, if the system breaks, you want to have a parallel system that you can bootstrap from. You don't want to start at zero. And that means that instead of accelerating the decline, you should accelerate the creation of a parallel system. And then outlive, outcompete, outmaneuver what already exists. So accelerationism, in my opinion, it's a nihilistic strategy that at best doesn't work at all, and at worst just strengthens your enemy. If you have an issue with how bad your government is today, just wait how bad it is when it feels threatened, and how bad it becomes when it has more technology and less legal and ethical restraints. I think accelerationism is basically stupid and suicidal.
Well, in a way, it's like still focusing on the negative, right?
Yeah.
It's focusing on what you don't want and speeding that up. So even if that would work, and the thing you don't like breaks down through the speed up process, you still haven't built an alternative.
Yeah,
which would be the positive thing you should build in the first place.
And that is actually the hard part. The hard part is to build something, not to take something down. And having this expectation that when you crash everything else and destroy everything else, that then building something new is easier. I think that's a fool's notion. Building something now is all you have to do.
All right. One final question we got by email. We got it in German, but I'm going to translate it to English. I find howtovanish.com very helpful, even though it's outdated and US-centric. If there are a more current and Europe-centric version about the topic, how can I make my life as anonymous as possible?
I'm not aware of any comparable German book. And
Europe-centric.
Well,
or website.
The problem in all that field is that all of these legal methods are really dependent on your environment, on your jurisdiction, and they don't age well. And I think that one should rather take an abstract approach to the problem. The abstract approach to the problem of being more anonymous is leaving less data. That is the abstract approach. And in my opinion, in a technological world, that has less to do with how you manipulate the system and more to do with how not to use the system in the first place.
Yeah, I think it also depends. I mean, you kind of mentioned the legal approach. I think that's what you're referring to with How to Vanish and a lot of the other methods, basically, where people kind of try to set up, let's say, kind of what we touched on earlier, set up a shell company, use mailboxes, kind of use deterrents or indirections to hide their legal names through legal vehicles, for example. And
most of these methods are leaky as shit in the long run.
Yeah, and I think it also really depends on your threat model. What I've seen a lot of the people in the space, their threat model is basically against, let's say, stalkers or your crazy ex or, something like that. But it's not actually against the state. I mean, most of the legal methods don't work against the state. And like you said, it's a highly changing environment. I mean, of course, you should try to read information find good information about the subject, but it is more a field which you kind of need to practice instead of, you read up on it and
yeah, that doesn't work.
It's like IT security in a sense that it's always changing, and you have to keep up with trends. And I think overall it's getting harder to stay anonymous. And like you already said, if you want to be anonymous or more anonymous, you kind of have to opt out in many areas of the existing system.
And that is hard. I mean, we know people that have to hide from the state, and that's not just a lifestyle, that's life defining. That's what most of your time goes in, most of your productivity, most of your capital is just to maintain that you stay hidden. And it's not a very attractive lifestyle.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to what we discussed earlier in the show, that for these transnational criminal organizations having this area to retreat to, that it makes them like really dangerous and powerful. And I think a good example of that is the Red Army faction in Germany. Mm-hmm. They had that, I think, for a while, and
multiple actually, both East Germany and Lebanon. Yeah,
but I also there's a famous book on the subject which kind of describes this period where they basically were hiding in Germany when they already had a lot of pressure on them for law enforcement to find them, and basically it kind of describes how this ate up all their resources. I mean, all their time, all their money, even the crimes they committed then were basically crimes to get the money in order to hide, for the crimes they already committed.
Yeah.
It's basically, it can become really all consuming very quickly.
And I think the best way to actually get off the radar today is to realize that you have to do that with other people. It works best in a community where you have a few people that do the interaction with the official system, so to speak, and that protect people from the gaze of Goron. So proxy merchants, people that rent apartments for you, etc. And in a lot of places that is borderline illegal already, but you can get through with that a little bit. But it has to do, if it works, it has to do with your vocation. It has to do with if you're willing to drop credit cards, if you're willing to drop the cell phone, if you're willing to drop non-anonymous internet use, if you're willing to move quite a lot and stuff like that. So if you really want to disappear, the best option for that is probably a small hut in the deep forest of Russia.
Yeah, I would also say Eastern Europe is probably.
Canada, maybe.
Yeah. But even there, you can have more problems with drones.
Yeah.
Regarding the proxy merchants, it's kind of interesting because in a sense it increases anonymity for both parties.
Mm-hmm.
The proxy merchant kind of does a mixing. Let's say he orders stuff through Amazon for a lot of people. His
profile gets worse. Yeah. His profile gets worse.
His profile gets worse, but it's also very mixed. I mean, it depends what people order, of course. But it's like, when you order stuff for your girlfriend, for example, it's like, okay.
And suddenly Amazon tells you that you're pregnant.
Yeah, or recommend things you would never buy. But and at the same time, yeah, it improves, of course, the person being anonymized. Another thing I want to mention, I think it's worth repeating, is that compartmentalization is really key. I mean, it's really easy to fall into this black and white thinking. No, I've been there, you know, like it's very appealing, this thought, okay, I want to be like completely anonymous and completely drop off the radar. And then when you realize, okay, that has this huge cost attached to it, which usually people are not willing to pay unless they have a really good reason for it. Because like you also mentioned, it's extremely expensive and makes you unproductive because of the expenses incurred. But with compartmentalization, you can create, let's say, a NIM, which does some side business online for cryptocurrencies, stuff like that, which you can, where you can be more extreme in your anonymity, or, you know, you sign up for the forum and discuss with people on a pseudonym. And before that, you set up your tails and, you know, you kind of practice it in one area without having to change your entire life. I think that's really worthwhile and usually much more realistic than going like full blown anonymous.
Yeah. Agreed.
Cool. I think that's...
You forgot something.
What?
You didn't tell us how much money we made in terms of the minimum wage.
Oh shit. Yeah.
That's really important.
The listeners are probably really eager to hear that. So we usually report the donations also in the terms of the German minimum wage. So basically take all the donations, subtract the cost, and look at how much time we spent for the episodes and all the other work around it. And so this time we made, after all episodes making less than 100% of the German minimum wage, this time we made 2,214% of the German minimum wage.
Finally.
Man.
Thank you again for everybody who donated.
Yeah, thanks again. If this keeps on like this, are you going to go full time? Or?
No, I think that will become boring to our listeners sooner or later. We have to do real stuff so we can talk about it.
Agreed. But it's very motivating to get some support and feedback, and we try to keep up a regular schedule of episodes. So thank you very much for listening to this episode, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you and goodbye.